So I've prepared this little video for our Class 12 topics of proposal and funding development, which I hope will be helpful to you as you try to understand these topics and in order for me to be able to convey this information without being there. So your chapter 15 starts with discussing the preliminary assessment that has to be done to determine funder interest. So what we call this is prospecting, is trying to find out what people want to spend their money on, specifically people at foundations, grant-making institutions, or even contract agencies with the government. So in order to start this process, you have to first determine how you can meet funder interests. So the first important is to have a really good reason why you're asking for the money. A reason that makes sense, that is rooted in the feasibility to get something done, to accomplish the goals and objectives, not too different from what we talked about in terms of having a strategy, having a logic model. Demonstrating the capability that you can in fact deliver on what you are asking for, and also being able to describe the financial consequences of what you're doing. All of this, as I'm sure you can see, relates to the case statement outline that I gave you and which you're going to work on at the end of this presentation. Foundation requirements usually include needing to be a 501c3 organization, which is the typical designation for a social or human service agency that is rendering services as a nonprofit tax exempt. If you don't have that designation, one of the other ways you can maybe still pursue money from foundations is by having a fiscal agent. Now, either you need to be able to describe yourself as a very competent fiscal agent, having a well-developed accounting department and demonstrated history of managing grants and contracts. And the other item is the strategic plan, being able to show that you have a plan in place and this project that you're asking money for somehow fits that. So these are all the things that you want to have going into asking for money, because otherwise you probably won't stand a chance. The fundable nature of the project speaks to having a specific project that hopefully relates directly to what the organization that you're asking for money from wants to fund. That's usually the way things are in this day and age. People just don't give you money to use as you see fit. You usually have to have a project that matches what they're funding. So when you're also talking about this area in your group project, about where you're going to get money from, I hope you're going to take the time to do the research to make sure that you are matching to foundations that in fact fund projects like the activity that your organization is engaged in. Another way that operations get funded is for general operations. Generally, this is called core operating money, where a foundation or a funding source will give money just to keep an organization functioning. We don't see a lot of these in this day and age, but there are still some places that will give you money because they recognize that you're a good organization and you need some funding to be able to make the whole agency work, including the specific project. The proposal format that is outlined in the chapter is very close to the Grantsmanship Center proposal outline that I also provide for you on Cougar courses. And I really, if you're interested in this type of subject as well as to learn more about it, I strongly suggest you read that short outline that's provided. It really is very good, and I use this as well with new program managers to orient them into how they should organize their thoughts around a proposal. This, once again, is not too different from the case statement, but it's more in the format of the way you ask for proposals. And here's the categories. So the first is usually you're asked for a summary, which is similar to an abstract, which you're very familiar with. A short description, sometimes it's called an executive summary, but something that gives you an overview of the project. And the project components will include the statement of need, defining the problem and the change that you hope will occur, the goals and objectives, which nowadays we use the logic model, the program components, including the activities and tasks, the objectives that support the goals being accomplishment, an evaluation component where you really are able to compare the results you intended to have happen with the actual outcomes that happen. So these are the pre and post surveys, tests, the outcome studies, more in a research vein. The organizational capability is an important component because you have to establish the credibility of the agency to do the work, and this will happen in the intro section. Also, usually at the tail end, because now everyone is talking the language of sustainability, you're going to want to be able to indicate how future funding will happen, how you will be able to get investment from others to keep the project going. The budget narrative is clear and has many of the components that we talked about in the budgeting class, and you can follow that as well. And then finally, the appendices, which are meant to also lend credibility and credence to the fact that you have examples, you have other evidence of the way your project can be successful and actually use the money in a reliable and way that can demonstrate outcomes. The approach to seeking funding is simple, or I should say is evolving in some ways, because you still need the kind of old school interest letter that helps introduce you. The personal contact is always very important. As I have described to you many times, the ways in which I have attracted support to many of these innovative projects like Mobile Fresh is to make those personal contacts, take people on tours, get them connected to the concept and the vision and hopefully the passion of your organization. And finally, there's the component of the internet in this day and age, which folks rely on, sometimes overly so. You got to be careful with that. You just can't send emails. Sometimes that gets you in the door. It operates like the interest letter, but you have to do more than that. Your text also talks about a 3-to-1 ratio, that applying for every 4 you will apply for, you might get 1. Actually, I think that's pretty aggressive. I mean, we get about a 20% return, so I guess it's 1 in 5 that we usually get some sort of support from. But that's after really developing a seasoned approach to being able to write proposals and grants. Your chapter also outlines pretty good criteria for what you need to have in order to be successful at this. It's on actually page 340 to 342, and they talk about staff competency, having people who have the knowledge of the program, the track record, and the passion. I've mentioned to you a few times that we have really not pursued substance abuse funding. We just hired a new clinic director who has that interest and passion, and we are now going to start pursuing some of that. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you have people on board who have the competencies for what you're describing you're going to do. Member participation, having board members and others participate, sometimes in the presentation, sometimes in the funding. As we said, it's important to demonstrate 100% financial participation from your governing board. And sometimes you even include clients who maybe have benefited from a pilot project that speaks to it and their personal testimony or involvement, especially if you get visited by a program manager of the funding source. That could be really helpful. The desirability of the project, does the funder value it? Much like we talked about customer value, you have to meet needs and wants. They are a customer in this case, the entity that you're asking for funding from. Urgency, sometimes funders respond better to urgent situations if the rest of the building blocks fall into place, that they see it as a credible and needed service that fits their criteria. Sometimes it's knowing what the hot issues are, and that's why we like to stay on top of being out in the community, being out with the funding sources, helping to influence what's going to be funded, as well as knowing what's coming down the road so you can position yourself. Feasibility, as we spoke about earlier, having a successful rationale, as we will talk about in the next class. Evidence-based practices are big now. Being able to show that something is documented and has been researched and shown that it works somewhere else goes a long way in helping to be successful in this. Leveraging funds, what other support can you demonstrate? That's why the budget that you're preparing, I suggest that you look at a bunch of different ways you could raise resources to help make it happen. Continuity, what history do you have of sustainability and replicability? So I have an agency that is now in its 65th year. I can demonstrate that when we take on projects, we're there for the long haul and show how we've built them and cultivated them and evolved them. That helps a funding source feel more comfortable about funding you. Potential impact, do you have transferable results? Can you create community organizational change as a result of the project you're being funded for? Dedication, is there perseverance in the organization? Is there other resources that you're good at securing? Can you demonstrate that? Having longtime board members, longtime staff can oftentimes be used to leverage that component. Clarity, as I indicated on the case management statement, use clear language, be concise, be organized, use charts like that logic model chart. That helps a lot in conveying the fact that you know how to document what you're doing and do it in a way that the customer can hear it, see it, feel it, touch it. Fiscal soundness, the budget has to work. That's why, as I mentioned in the last class, you're doing a pro forma. It's to hopefully struggle, because it is a struggle, with how do you get resources to match what you want to do. And so you have to vet all those assumptions. Can you find money in these different pockets? Are you competitive in the marketplace for what you're asking for in comparison to what others get paid or fund to do the same thing? And finally, your results record. What has been the results of your efforts over years, hopefully in related type services, but even in general as an agency? Can you demonstrate that you have been a successful entity, not that you've just been there, but what have you done that's made a difference? Again, going back to our original mission discussion, what differences have you made in the world? And how does this connect to the type of differences that the funder wants to make? So that's a short kind of synopsis of Chapter 15 and how you can prepare effective proposals. In your groups today, you're going to work on the case statement, which I think will help pull together a lot of these concepts in a way that will help you describe not only what you're doing on your project, but also in the future how you describe the types of service activities you get involved in human development and human service endeavors. Chapter 16 was more about the process of seeking funding, and it talked about the different ways money is garnered by such organizations, the community foundations. They talked about foundation types, so there's community foundations that basically take funds from donors and designate them for local kinds of activities, kind of like the fund I described in our last session that we got for our Friends of the Family endowment. Private independent funds sometimes are just private, usually folks who maybe have had a company and raised a large amount of money and have dedicated some of that to a private foundation that wants to fund a specific cause, and that's usually driven by donors or the families of the individuals. Corporate or company foundations, which are just like it sounds, they come from company interests that want to fund activities that they feel are near and dear to maybe what their company made money in, specialized in, and so forth. And then you have direct corporate giving, which is more the marketing side. So in our case, for example, we go to Walmart locally to help with small grants, 5 to 10,000 for different events or specific activities that we're putting on, and then we'll go regionally for larger things like the retrofit of the bus for Mobile Fresh, and then we go nationally to Benton, Arkansas, to their foundation, which is also also a family foundation under the name of the founders of Walmart. So there are various ways that foundations get set up and you can pursue money. Your book cites some good website sources. Nowadays, in the old days, you used to have to go and research this paper and pencil. You'd have to go down to the Foundation Center, in my case in Los Angeles, and look through all the books and try to match. Now, my grant writer has a program she paid $5,000 for. She gets updates each year, and all she does is type in the fields. I want to know who's funding teenagers with substance abuse problems who live in San Diego and are in single-parent families. Boom, you press the button. In less than a minute, you've got all the matches of what you should be looking for. So although that might seem like it's made the world easier, it has, but it's also complicated it because now you get a lot of feedback and have to weed through it. The search process, prospecting, as I talked about earlier, for me is that whole customer value equation all over again. Having a strategy, targeting, focusing, prioritizing, trying to find the match between what the foundation, the individual, the corporation wants to fund and what you're providing. Prospective funders, there's a worksheet on page 350 and a search on page 351, which is pretty helpful and pretty good, but this is all part of that prospecting approach. Government funding happens at every level, federal, state, county, city. The approach here is to get data. So you need to know numbers and impacts of the entity. If you're talking about a congressional district, a supervisorial district, a city, you need to know who your competition is. You need to know the politics, the political influence, the kind of things that are unspoken but position you to be successful. You've heard the saying, all politics are local. Well, in some ways, all funding is local when it comes to government funding. The federal grants, which are the most competitive, are very difficult because you don't have a lot of those really grassroots relationships that really help make it happen. The thing with government funding that you have to particularly pay attention to is the kind of unfunded mandates that happen where, yes, you get money, but there's a lot that you have to do that may not be funded in the grant, and that makes it a little difficult. Government contracting is a little different, and this is where you specifically contract. It's not so much a grant as it is a contract for services, like you're going to provide counseling hours, or you're going to provide meals, or you're going to provide, in some cases, housing, maybe with Section 8 grants or something else. Now, this has actually enabled human service organizations to grow in a lot of ways. This comes out of the concepts of devolution, where the government, dating back to the 80s, was going to get out of the business of providing certain services and contracting with others to do it. A lot of for-profits got into this work, but it also made it possible for nonprofits. Block grants, such as child care and CDBG, are monies that have come to the states in large numbers, and the states get to use them as they will. So rather than being directly funded from the federal government, it's kind of disseminated in large block grants that the local levels are able to determine. This is a good idea in concept, but it also opens it up to a lot of political influences. Cost reimbursement, as we discussed when we talked about budgeting, is being reimbursed for your performance, what you're producing, versus just a line out in budget. And that leads into the performance base, which also sometimes is bigger picture issues like, did you improve the health and well-being of an entire community? All of these, when you're dealing with government contracting, involve federal, county, and state issues that you have to be aware of, you have to be connected to. And that's why we like to be advocates, we like to be at the table, we like to help be writing the grants themselves, being on task forces and advisory boards to government, because not just that we want to influence the outcome, but we also have the knowledge of what clients and customers need, because the human service, human development, especially nonprofit agencies, are closest to the customer. Your chapter also talks about lobbying, because that plays a role, as I've been saying, in trying to get these type of government-funded resources. A lot of people think, well, you're not supposed to do that. You can do that. I am not going to present to you a whole PowerPoint presentation that I do on this, but essentially there are some limitations. You can only spend so much of your budget, but you are allowed to lobby. More importantly, we usually don't call it lobbying, We usually call it education. So I go to Sacramento a lot, I go to city councils, I go to board of supervisors, and what I try to do is educate the elected officials on the issues that we see day in and day out with clients in an effort to get them to allocate resources towards that. So that's the summary of the chapters that I hope you read and pay attention to as you now get ready to embark on your case statement as a group, which should pull together your entire project. As I mentioned earlier, also on Cougar courses are some other resources for you on a fundraising basic tutorial, a grantsmanship center proposal guide, and of course the case statement that we went over in class, and also the executive summary from the Mobile Fresh project, which in effect incorporates all those concepts with the case statement. With the case statement principles and sections. So if you look at all of this, it should give you a good idea of how you go and not only do the case statement, but how you're able to tell the story about the project and the organization you're developing. This particular item will be replaced with the video that you're seeing, and so you just click on it and it should take you there. So enjoy the rest of the class, and I will see you right after Thanksgiving.